I never thought the day I buried my mother would also be the day I lost the last piece of her she ever gave me. I was standing outside the funeral home, still wearing black, my hands shaking as I tried to hold myself together, when my phone rang for the third time. I almost ignored it. Nothing in that moment felt important enough to answer, but something in my gut told me to pick up. It was my neighbor. Her voice was uneven, like she had been running. She said something that didn't make sense at first. She said there were people at my childhood home, strangers, moving boxes, a truck parked in the driveway like it belonged there. And then she said the words that made my chest go completely cold. She said, "They're saying your mother-in-law sold the house." For a few seconds, I couldn't even respond. I just stood there in silence, staring at nothing, while the world around me kept moving like I wasn't breaking inside. The funeral director was calling families inside. Someone brushed past me. Life continued like normal. But mine didn't. Because that house wasn't just a house. It was my childhood. It was my mother's laughter in the kitchen. It was her handwriting still faintly on the inside of a cabinet door. It was the only place I still felt like I belonged to something real. And my mother-in-law, she sold it while I was burying my own mother. I remember walking back to my car without even realizing I was moving. My body felt disconnected, like I was watching someone else fall apart. I tried calling my husband first. No answer. Then again, straight to voicemail. That's when the first real wave of panic hit me, sharp and sickening. By the time I got into the car, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. I kept telling myself there had to be a mistake, some misunderstanding, some legal issue I didn't know about, but deep down, I already knew who was behind it. My mother-in-law, Deanne. She never liked that house. She always called it old emotional baggage. She used to say I was too attached to things that no longer mattered, but she didn't understand what that place meant to me, or maybe she did. Maybe that was exactly why she chose it. As I drove, the road blurred in front of me. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to find a moment where this could have been stopped. My husband had the power of attorney paperwork after my mom got sick. I trusted him with it. I trusted all of them. That was the worst part. I didn't even see it coming. By the time I reached the street where I grew up, something inside me already felt wrong. There was a moving truck parked halfway on the curb. A man was carrying out a framed photo from my living room, like it belonged to him. I stepped out of the car slowly, like my body didn't fully understand what it was seeing. The front door was wide open. Voices echoed inside. People I didn't know were walking through my home like it was nothing more than a transaction. And then I saw her. Diane was standing near the porch, holding a clipboard, speaking calmly to the movers like she had done this 100 times before. She looked up and saw me, and for a second she didn't even react. No guilt, no hesitation, just a calm, almost rehearsed expression. Like I was the one interrupting her day. I remember the exact moment my heart shifted. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was something heavier, something colder. Because in that second, I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was planned. While I was sitting in a funeral home saying goodbye to my mother, she was here erasing her existence from my life. I took a step forward, my voice barely coming out when I finally said her name. Diane turned slightly, like she was annoyed I had arrived early. And that's when she said something I will never forget. She said, "Oh, good, you're here. We can finish paperwork later. The house is already gone." And just like that, everything inside me stopped. Because in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about a house. It was about how far she was willing to go, and what else she had already taken from me without me even knowing. And the worst part, I had no idea yet that this was only the beginning. I just stood there on that driveway, unable to move, while everything around me kept going like I wasn't even part of it. The movers kept walking in and out of my childhood home, carrying pieces of my life like they were just objects. No one asked me anything. No one even looked at me twice. It felt like I had already been erased, even though I was still standing there breathing. And the strange part is, none of this started today. It didn't start with the funeral. It didn't even start with Diane. It started years ago, when I first married into that family. My husband, Mark, was always caught in the middle. Too afraid to stand up to his mother, too nice to push back when it mattered. At first, I told myself it was just how their family worked. Different boundaries, different dynamics. I tried to adjust. I tried to fit in. But Diane never made it easy. From day one, she treated me like I was temporary, like I was just passing through her son's life. Every conversation had this subtle edge to it, like she was always testing me. Not openly cruel, not enough for anyone else to notice, but just enough for me to feel it. The house my mother left me changed everything in our marriage. It wasn't a mansion or anything impressive. It was small, old, slightly worn down at the edges. But to me, it was everything. My mother bought it when I was a child, and even when life got hard, she never let it go. It was the one place where I felt safe, even when everything else in life felt unstable. After she got sick, I spent more time there again. Sitting in her old chair, listening to the quiet, trying to hold on to the pieces of her that were still left in the walls. Mark said it made me too emotional. Diane said it made me stuck in the past. But I didn't care, because grief doesn't move on a schedule. When my mother passed away, everything felt like it collapsed at once. I remember standing in that hospital room, holding her hand until it went cold. That feeling never really left me. Even at the funeral, I felt like I was walking through life without fully being inside it. And through all of that, Diane was oddly calm, almost supportive in a way that never felt real. She handled practical things: paperwork, legal arrangements, bank details. She kept saying I didn't need to worry about anything right now. I didn't question it. I was too exhausted to question anything. That was my mistake. I remember one conversation clearly. It was a week before the funeral. I was sitting in my mom's house alone, going through old photo albums when Diane called. She asked me, very casually, if I had considered simplifying things after the estate was settled. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant. I told her I wasn't thinking about selling anything, that the house wasn't just property to me. She gave this soft laugh, like I was being sentimental, and said something like, "We'll talk after everything settles." Looking back now, that wasn't a suggestion. It was a plan. Mark never told me any of this was happening. Or maybe he did, and I just didn't hear it clearly enough. That's the hardest part to accept, because betrayal doesn't always feel like a sharp cut. Sometimes it feels like slow silence. Like things are happening just outside your awareness until one day you realize you've already lost everything. And I trusted them, both of them. I trusted that, while I was breaking down, they would protect what mattered to me. Instead, they decided what mattered to me didn't matter at all. That night, after standing outside my childhood home watching strangers move my life out piece by piece, I finally got a message from Mark. Just one line. "It's complicated. We'll talk later." That was it. No explanation, no apology, no urgency. Just complicated. And in that moment, something inside me went very quiet. Not angry yet, not fully broken either, just aware. A feeling that whatever was coming next wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about how much of my life had already been decided without me. And I wasn't ready yet to understand just how far they had gone. I remember standing outside that house longer than I should have, just watching strangers move through rooms that still felt like mine. Every sound hit differently. The creak of the floorboards, the low voices of movers, the dull thud of boxes being set down. It all felt wrong, like reality had been slightly shifted, and I was the only one noticing. I finally stepped forward, my voice coming out quieter than I expected, and asked one of the movers what was going on. He barely looked at me when he said the house had been legally sold earlier that morning. Cash deal, signed paperwork, clean transfer. He said it like he was reading the weather. That's when I turned back to Deanne. She was still standing near the porch, calm, collected, like none of this carried any weight. I asked her what she had done. My voice was shaking now, not just from grief, but from something sharper underneath it. She didn't even flinch. She just adjusted the papers in her hand and said everything was handled properly, that it was time to move forward. Move forward. Like I hadn't just buried my mother hours ago. Like my entire past wasn't still sitting inside those walls. I took a step closer, trying to understand what kind of explanation could possibly exist for this. I asked her how she could sell my childhood home without telling me, without even a conversation. That's when she finally looked at me directly, and what I saw in her expression wasn't guilt. It was control. She told me, very calmly, that Mark had already signed off on everything weeks ago, that the power of attorney covered estate transitions if I was emotionally unavailable. She even used that phrase like it was something normal, like grief was a legal inconvenience. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a rushed decision. This was planned, step by step. While I was sitting beside my dying mother, they were already deciding what to take. I left the porch and walked straight to my car, not because I accepted it, but because I needed air. I needed distance. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. I kept replaying her words over and over again. Emotionally unavailable. Time to move forward. Signed weeks ago. None of it made sense in a way that felt human. I called Mark again. This time he picked up. There was noise in the background, normal life noise, like he wasn't standing in the middle of my world collapsing. I asked him one question, just one. Why? There was a pause on the other end, long enough for me to already know I wasn't going to like the answer. Then he said it. He said, Mom thought it was the best decision. You weren't in the right headspace to handle the estate stuff. I remember gripping the phone so tightly it started to hurt. I asked him if he was serious, if he understood what he was saying. I told him I was at my mother's funeral while they were selling her house. There was another pause, shorter this time, like he was impatient. And then he said something that completely changed the air between us. He said, "It's just a house. You're acting like it's more than that." That sentence landed harder than anything Diane had said. Because it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just her decision. This was both of them. I didn't even realize I had stopped breathing properly until I hung up. My chest felt tight, like there wasn't enough space inside me to hold what I was feeling. I sat there in the car for a long time, just staring at the dashboard, trying to understand how the people I trusted most had reduced my entire life into something disposable. And then my phone buzzed again. A message from Diane. Just one line. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. That was it. No explanation, no apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done, just a warning, like I was the problem for reacting to it. That was the moment something inside me stopped trying to understand them. Because you can only look for logic in betrayal for so long before you realize there is none to find. Some people don't make decisions because they are right. They make them because they believe they can. And I started to see it clearly now. Diane didn't just take my house. She took advantage of every moment I was too broken to defend myself. And Mark didn't stop her. He helped. I drove back home that night without really remembering the route. My mind kept looping between anger and disbelief, like it couldn't settle on one emotion. When I got inside, the silence of my own house felt different. Not peaceful. Empty. Like something had already been taken from here too, even if I couldn't see it yet. I sat down at the kitchen table and finally let myself think clearly for the first time since the funeral. There were too many gaps, too many things that didn't add up. The timing, the paperwork, the speed of everything. This wasn't a sudden decision. This had been in motion for weeks. Maybe even longer. And then I remembered something Diane had said months ago, almost casually, during dinner. She had mentioned future planning for family assets. At the time, I brushed it off. I thought she meant general advice. Now it sounded different, planned, intentional. I opened my laptop and started digging through emails, documents, anything I could find. At first, it was just confusion, then frustration, then something worse. Because buried in a shared folder I had never really looked at, I found drafts, legal drafts, conversations between Diane and Mark about asset simplification. My name wasn't included in most of them, but the house was. Always the house. And as I read further, one line made my stomach drop completely. A note from Diane to the lawyer that simply said, "She will be too emotional to interfere at the time of execution." Execution. Not sale. Not transfer. Execution. I leaned back from the screen, my hands cold now, my mind suddenly very quiet. This wasn't just betrayal in the emotional sense anymore. This was planning, coordination, timing. They didn't just take something from me. They studied me first. And that's when I realized the worst part wasn't what they had done. It was how long they had been preparing to do it. And I still didn't know what else they had already taken that I hadn't found yet. After finding those emails, I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there in the dark of my living room, staring at my laptop screen long after everything had gone silent. The house around me felt unfamiliar in a way I can't fully explain, like even my own space was starting to feel unsafe. Every small sound made me jump a little. The fridge, the pipes, even my own breathing felt too loud. My mind kept replaying the same words over and over again. She will be too emotional to interfere. It wasn't just what they did. It was how sure they were that I wouldn't stop them, that I wouldn't even understand until it was already finished. And the worst part is they were right. By morning, I felt like I hadn't fully rested in days. My body was there, but my thoughts weren't organized anymore. Everything felt scattered. I kept checking my phone without knowing what I was expecting to find. An apology maybe, some kind of explanation that made it less cruel, but there was nothing, just silence from both of them. I tried calling Mark again, straight to voicemail, again. That silence felt louder than anything he could have said. So I drove. I didn't even plan where I was going at first. I just needed movement, anything that wasn't sitting still with my thoughts. But somehow, my hands kept taking me back to the same place. My mother's house, or what used to be my mother's house. When I arrived, the moving truck was gone. The strangers were gone. Even Diane was gone. It looked like nothing had happened, which somehow made it worse. The house stood there quietly, almost respectfully, like it didn't know it had been taken away from me. I walked up the steps slowly and tried the door. Locked. Of course it was. For a moment, I just stood there with my hand still on the door handle, feeling something inside me crack in a way I didn't fully understand yet. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like something finally giving up after holding too much for too long. And then it hit me. Not anger first, not sadness. Realization. They weren't just taking the house. They were removing me from my own history, piece by piece, quietly, legally, cleanly. So no one would even question it. I sat on the front steps for a long time. I don't know how long. Time started feeling loose, like it wasn't structured anymore. I kept thinking about my mother, about how she used to sit in that exact doorway during summers, watching the street like she was protecting something invisible. She always said, "This house remembers us." At the time, I thought it was just something sentimental she said. Now I wasn't so sure. Because if a place can hold memories, then what does it mean when someone decides to erase it? My phone rang again. This time it was Diane. I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear her voice, wanted to understand how she could sound normal after everything. When I picked up, there was no greeting, no hesitation. She just asked if I had calmed down yet. Calmed down. Like this was a disagreement I needed to recover from. I told her I had seen everything. The emails, the drafts, the planning. There was a short pause on the line, and for the first time, I heard something different in her voice. Not guilt. Annoyance. She told me I was going through files I didn't understand, that I was making assumptions based on emotion instead of legal reality. She said everything was done for my own protection. Protection. That word again. I stood up from the steps at that point, my legs finally feeling steady again, but something inside me was starting to change. I asked her one question. Why not tell me? There was another pause, longer this time. Then she said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said, because you would have tried to stop it. And that was it. That was the truth behind everything. Not confusion, not misunderstanding, control. They didn't want my opinion, because my opinion was an obstacle. After the call ended, I just stood there in silence, holding the phone in my hand. The wind moved through the street like nothing important had happened, like my entire life hadn't just shifted underneath me. And that's when something new started to take shape inside me. Not rage, not panic. Clarity. Because once you realize someone didn't misunderstand you, they simply didn't care, everything becomes different. You stop asking, why would they do this? And you start asking something else entirely. What else have they already decided for me? I went back home later that day and started going through everything again. Emails, shared folders, old messages. This time I wasn't looking for answers. I was looking for patterns. And I found them. Small things at first. Financial adjustments I was never told about. Documents I never signed but somehow were marked as acknowledged. Conversations between Mark and Diane that slowly built a timeline I was never included in. It wasn't one decision. It was layers. Carefully placed layers. And the more I read, the more something inside me stopped breaking and started focusing. Because grief makes you soft. But betrayal makes you awake. And I was finally starting to see how far this went. This wasn't just about my mother's house anymore. It was about how much of my life had already been quietly rearranged, without me ever being in the room. And I still didn't know the full picture. But I knew one thing for sure now. They weren't done yet. After that night, something in me stopped reacting the same way. The panic was gone. The confusion was gone too. What replaced it wasn't calm exactly, but something sharper. Focus. I stopped calling Mark. I stopped arguing with Deanne, because I finally understood something important. They weren't going to explain themselves, and I wasn't going to get honesty by asking for it. If I wanted truth, I had to find it another way. So I started documenting everything. Every email, every draft, every timeline, every inconsistency. I created a separate folder on my laptop and named it simply Reality. Not emotions, not opinions, just facts. What they did when they did it. Who signed what, who was present, who benefited. And slowly, the story started to become clear in a way they never expected. The house wasn't sold in isolation. It was part of a larger financial restructuring. I found references to insurance updates, estate adjustments, and asset consolidation plans that all circled around the same timeframe. The week my mother's condition worsened. That wasn't coincidence. That was timing. Careful timing. And the more I read, the more I realized something else that made my stomach tighten. Deanne wasn't just involved socially or emotionally. She was actively guiding the process through legal channels, using language that made everything sound protective and temporary, but always pointing toward one outcome. Transfer control before I could react. I didn't confront them again, not yet, because I knew something they didn't. People like Diane don't expect silence from someone they've already labeled as emotional. They expect reaction. They expect chaos. So instead, I did the opposite. I got organized. I contacted the lawyer listed in the documents, not aggressively, not accusingly. I asked for clarification as if I was still confused, still unsure. And that's when I got something interesting, a hesitation. The lawyer said something didn't feel fully transparent about the final authorization process, that certain signatures were submitted under delegated authority. Delegated authority. Mark. That was the first real crack. Not in emotion, in structure. Because once legal language starts to shift, everything else becomes unstable. I didn't tell Mark I knew. I didn't tell Diane I was looking. I stayed quiet. I listened. I collected. I waited. And during that waiting, I noticed something else. Diane started becoming impatient. Small messages at first, then sharper ones, asking if I was moving on properly, telling me not to drag emotional issues into legal matters. The tone changed. She was no longer pretending to guide me. She was trying to contain me. That's when I made my first move. I requested a full copy of all estate-related transactions tied to my mother's property. Not through family, not through Mark, directly through formal legal channels. It forced visibility. It forced records to surface. And it worked. Because 3 days later, I received something that changed everything. A secondary amendment attached to the original estate file. One I had never seen. One that shifted partial control of remaining assets into a temporary trustee structure. And the trustee listed was not just Mark. It was Diane. I remember sitting there reading that line over and over again, not because I didn't understand it, but because I finally understood it too clearly. This wasn't just manipulation. This was placement. She didn't just take the house. She positioned herself inside the entire system that controlled what came next. And I was never meant to be part of it. That night, I didn't sleep again, but this time I wasn't broken. I was building something. I created a second folder. This one wasn't called reality. It was called evidence. And I started preparing everything in a way I had never done before. Clean timelines, documented contradictions, legal inconsistencies, email chains, signed authority gaps. Not emotional accusations. Just structure. Because I realized something simple but powerful. People like Diane don't fear anger. They fear exposure. And for the first time since the funeral, I did something I hadn't done before. I stopped being the person reacting to what they did, and started becoming the person watching what they did very closely. I didn't know exactly how it would end yet, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity now. This wasn't just about taking my childhood home. It was about who had been controlling my life while I was too grieving to notice. And now that I was noticing, they were about to realize I wasn't as emotionally unavailable as they thought. I was just getting started. The morning everything finally broke open didn't feel dramatic at first. It felt strangely normal, quiet, almost calm. I was sitting at my kitchen table with the same folders open in front of me, the same documents, the same names repeated again and again. But this time, everything was arranged. Clean, clear, undeniable. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't emotionally reacting anymore. I had a full timeline built from their own signatures, their own emails, their own legal steps. And for the first time since my mother died, I felt something steady inside me. Not anger. Control. I sent one email that morning, just one. To the lawyer, to the estate office, and to a private contact I had confirmed after days of verification. No emotional language, no accusations, just documentation attached, with a request for formal review of all transactions involving my mother's estate and the transfer of property rights during my absence. Then I waited. I didn't call Mark. I didn't warn Diane. I didn't give them a chance to prepare a response built on excuses or manipulation. Because this time, I wasn't asking questions. I was triggering consequences. The first call came from Mark. I let it ring. Then again. And again. Finally, I answered. His voice was different immediately, not confident like before, not dismissive. There was something tight in it now, controlled panic trying to hide itself. He asked me what I had done. Not why, not what is this about. Just what I had done. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain anything more than necessary. I simply told him that everything had been formally submitted for review and that I was no longer discussing it privately. There was a long silence on the other end. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said, "You're going to destroy everything over a house." And for the first time, I actually laughed a little, because he still didn't understand. It was never just a house. It was my mother's life. It was my history. It was what they decided they could erase, because they thought I wouldn't notice until it was too late. Diane called next. I answered this time. Her tone was different immediately. Gone was the calm control. Gone was the careful wording. She sounded sharper now, irritated, like something she thought was permanent had suddenly become unstable. She told me I was making a mistake, that I was turning a family matter into something legal and unnecessary. She tried to reframe it again like she always did, emotional, unstable, overreacting. But her voice was different now, because she knew I wasn't listening the same way anymore. I let her talk. I didn't interrupt. I just listened while she slowly revealed everything she still thought she could control. And then I said it. Calmly. I told her I had already spoken to the estate office and the reviewing attorney, that everything was under formal examination now, including her role as trustee. There was a pause. A real one this time. Not rehearsed, not controlled. And in that silence, I heard something I had never heard from her before. Uncertainty. The next few days moved differently. I didn't chase updates. I didn't call anyone. I didn't try to force outcomes. I just let the process unfold while I stayed exactly where I was, documenting every shift that came in. And the shifts came fast. Emails started returning unanswered. Phone calls stopped being returned. Then came the formal notice. A review had been initiated. Certain actions were temporarily paused pending verification of authorization legitimacy. Pause. That word mattered more than anything else, because it meant they no longer had free movement. And then came the moment I didn't expect. A message from Diane. Not a command, not a warning. A request. She asked to meet. In person. For the first time since everything began, she didn't try to control the narrative through distance. She wanted to see me directly. And I understood why. Because people like her don't change tactics unless they feel the ground shifting underneath them. I agreed. Not because I wanted closure, but because I wanted clarity. We met at a quiet cafe the next day. She looked different in person, still composed but less certain, like she was carefully holding herself together instead of naturally in control of the room. She started talking immediately, explaining, justifying, reframing everything as protective decisions made during an emotional period. She said she was trying to help me, that I was too overwhelmed to handle everything at once. And I listened, until she stopped talking. Then I finally asked her one question. Why was my grief treated like a weakness instead of something to respect? She didn't answer right away. And in that silence, I saw it clearly. There was no misunderstanding here, only justification. I stood up before she could continue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse her again. I just told her that everything would now continue through official channels. And as I turned to leave, I saw something I will never forget. For the first time, Diane wasn't ahead of the situation. She was inside it, and losing control of it. Weeks later, everything settled into its final shape. The review confirmed irregularities in authorization timing. Certain transfers were flagged. Control structures were reversed pending correction. The house, the documents, the decisions they made in silence while I was grieving all of it was no longer hidden behind clean paperwork. It was exposed. Not destroyed. Just seen. I never got a dramatic apology. I never got a full confession. What I got instead was distance. Silence from Mark. Withdrawal from Diane. A family structure that had been built on control slowly collapsing under its own documentation. And I realized something important in that quiet aftermath. Revenge didn't feel like fireworks. It felt like truth, finally being allowed to exist without interference. The house wasn't just returned in a single moment. It came back through correction, through process, through systems correcting what had been manipulated quietly for too long. And when I finally stepped back inside it again, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like restoration, like something that had been paused mid-breath was finally allowed to continue. I stood in my mother's old kitchen for a long time without speaking. The same light came through the same window. Nothing had changed in how the house looked. But everything had changed in how it belonged to me. Not because I fought louder than them, but because I stayed clear when they expected me to stay emotional. And in the end, that was what they never prepared for. If there is one thing I learned through all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't always look loud at the beginning. Sometimes it looks organized. Sometimes it looks legal. Sometimes it looks like people telling you they are helping you while quietly removing your voice from the process. But silence is not weakness. And grief is not permission. I didn't get justice the way people imagine it in stories. I got something quieter, something more lasting. I got my life back without asking for permission to take it. If this story hit you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your own experience. And if you've ever been betrayed by people closest to you, I want to hear your story. Next video is already waiting.